We are pleased and honored to welcome veteran James Grenier to our Remembrance Day program today. James is a 7-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. And James, I understand you knew as early as kindergarten that that was what you wanted to do.
Yes, sir. That's exactly it.
You had 3 choices. Tell me what they were.
So when I was in kindergarten, around that time frame there, I wrote down I wanted to be a police officer, a firefighter, or a soldier.
So how did soldier win out?
I hadn't graduated high school yet. And so I really wasn't able to go towards the police and everything else. And I went to the police force and they were like, "You're too young." Went to the fire department, like, "You're too young. You got to get some experience."
Right.
So I'm like, so I joined the military, and I loved it from the day I joined.
Was that decision somewhat influenced by any family members?
Yeah, so my grandfather served in the Canadian Armed Forces, and then I have a couple uncles who also served. And but it was just always very, my family was always very pro-Canada, very pro-military, and we always tried to make sure that we did the right thing.
You've thrown out an interesting tidbit about Canada and military history, and
Yes.
I had not realized this, but can you tell me?
Well, just basically, we have a country of all volunteers, and I'm sure someone could read a book and say I'm wrong on a couple of things in that, but every soldier, Army, Navy, Air Force, male or female, has been a volunteer in this country. And I think that is one of the greatest attributes that we have. Every single person who has donned the uniform has been a volunteer from World War I all the way up to today's date.
And it's also the only country where that's true?
I believe that to be, we are the only country in the world who has an all-volunteer military. Like right now, the American military is all volunteer. But World War I, they had a draft. World War II, they had a draft. Korea, they had a draft.
Yes.
Okay. Vietnam, they had a draft.
You enlisted in 1991?
I left February 1991 to go to CFB Cornwallis to do my basic training.
Were you an outlier? Were other friends of yours doing this?
I was definitely an outlier from a sense. So my high school I think we had about 300 people. I know of 4 of us who went to the Canadian military at that time frame there.
Do you connect with them still today?
No, one of them has passed away.
Right.
And the other 2, I knew them while we were in the military. I forget who they are now,
right,
from a sense of trying to remember from way back then.
Which is, that's
pretty common. New Year's Eve, 1992, I spent on the HMCS Preserver while we were in Somalia.
Right.
And I had a few drinks with him.
Right.
He was the ship steward.
Oh, wow.
So we had a couple drinks on the ship.
All the way over in Somalia, sharing stories about Welland.
Yeah, and then I had a couple beers, a couple drinks with a guy from Welland, Ontario, on the ship.
That's incredible.
It was absolutely incredible.
You were deployed 3 different units?
No, so I served in 3 different units. But I was deployed to Somalia in 1992. So when I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, you join as an infantry. And then I applied and I was received to the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, which is the Army of the West. So basically Manitoba, westward, that's where the PPCLI are located. And then after that, I applied to go to the Canadian Airborne Regiment, and I was successful. And then I served in 2 Commando from 1992 to 1995. And then after the disbandment after the Canadian Armed Forces disbanded the Canadian Airborne Regiment, I rebadged to the Royal Canadian Regiment, the RCRs, where I spent my last 2 years with the Royal Canadian Regiment, all at CFB Petawawa.
In Somalia, it was what we would call a peacemaking mission?
Yeah, so it was a peacemaking mission.
Was it related to the UN at that time?
It was. There's still UN is still involved.
Right.
Like UN still runs. Like they're still the head of everything. But for our mission, it was peacemaking versus peacekeeping. Peacekeeping, there is a peace to keep. Peacemaking, we were trying to get that peace in order to bring the leaders of Somalia, or the warlords, whatever you want to call them,
right,
to the table to communications.
And they were starving the public. It was a forced famine.
That's basically what they were doing. There was, I believe it was General Adid or Colonel Adid. He was sort of the leader of the Somalia crisis, and he was the person that, like when we went to Somalia, it was a multinational force. The Americans were there, the Canadians were there, the Belgiques were there, the Germans were there. I believe the Belgiques were there. And there was a lot of different forces. The Italians were there.
Right.
So we spent some time with the Italians. I met an Italian soldier in Somalia who I became friends with in Canada.
Incredible.
It's absolutely incredible.
After you retired, you have continued to be, I guess, interested and supportive of a lot of your fellow veterans.
Yes. So basically is the heroes of our nation, our forefathers, our foremothers, they are no longer to do what I'm doing today. And I believe our education system has not completed the task of informing our young people as to what happened. I know some people would like to forget about it, but you can never forget about what happened in the past, because everything that happened in the past sets up what happens in the future.
One of the things that you do is you do offer yourself to go in and speak to students.
100%. I speak to students every year. I have never turned down a speaking engagement to go talk to the youth in the Niagara region who want to be able to sit down and discuss what happened in the past. I also don't glamorize it. I don't make it sound like it's cool or anything. I talk about the people itself. During World War I, mostly men. World War II, mostly men, some women served. But then I talk about what was happening back home, what the women were doing back home, what the men were doing back home, who could not serve, who supported the war. So like World War II, it encompassed everybody, whether you were a child or whether you were already 60 years old. You were impacted by the war, and you were doing what you could to maintain everything that the Canadian Armed Forces needed overseas. You had a tire with a hole in it, well, you fixed it rather than going to buy a new tire. Well, you couldn't buy them anyway, but you did what you needed to do to get the job done.
Right.
And we forget what all of our forefathers and foremothers did in order to allow the soldiers to go overseas.
How important is Remembrance Day to you?
Remembrance Day is the most important day to me. It's the only day that I celebrate personally. Now, as a family member, as a dad, as a husband, I celebrate all the other days because my family does that. But this is the only day that I go full out for. And it's very important to me that we celebrate how we got to where we are. And I think that's what we are forgetting right now, is that in order to progress, you had to scramble a few eggs somewhere. And those eggs were scrambled. And we've lived quite peacefully over the World War II ended in 1945. And we've led quite peaceful lives since. And then a lot has to do with that with the Americans, how strong they are. And then we've lived in a great society in the last 20 years. And most of that has to do with the Americans.
Well, I would counter and say that most of that has to do with people like yourself. And I thank you for that, James, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate coming down here.